I'd rather be a good person than a good photographer. And to me, that means slowing down, taking the time, making that connection. When you are vulnerable with people and when you're willing to give of yourself to them as a photographer and as a person and as a journalist, then I think that we get a more complete and more honest look at the people.
Hello and welcome everyone to the Photo Forward podcast, where we explore the stories behind some of the greatest visual storytellers in the world. From their photographic origins to finding work-life balance as creative professionals to how to actually make a living as a photographer, cinematographer, or multimedia creator, we uncover what makes them tick and their shutters click. I'm your host, Ben Brewer. Today's episode is all about connections. Not in the smarmy LinkedIn request crap networking sort of way, but in the genuine engagement and empathic authenticity that you can only achieve from true photojournalism greatness. But before we get into all of today's episode, I want to give a big thanks to everyone who's listening, subscribing, and dropping a rating or review on the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening. It means so much to me seeing you guys connecting and really creating a community around the show. And going forward, I'm going to be shouting out some of my favorite reviews each week. So, comment of the week comes from the user D Willowtree with great insight. Looking forward to more. Thanks a ton, D Willowtree. I'm looking forward to making more. All right, let's get into the show. Who better to learn from than a photographer who would self-proclaim to rather be a good person than a great photographer? Building meaningful connections with the individuals in their photos, and building a rapport through words before ever picking up a camera to capture images. Today's guest, Alyssa Schukar, is an excellent resource to learn from for any working photographer. Alyssa Schukar is a Washington, D.C.-based documentary photographer and educator. In her personal work, she is most interested in documenting how the environment and public policies affect communities. She believes photojournalists advance and improve the industry by supporting each other. In 2019, Alyssa and two colleagues launched Prism Photo Workshops, which provides support and advocacy for young photographers of diverse backgrounds, which we'll get into all the details of in this week's episode as well. She is also a returning faculty member of the Missouri Photo Workshop. In this week's episode, we explore the process of transitioning from a staff position to freelancing work across the country, how to deeply connect with the individuals in your photos, even in a fast-paced news scenario, and why the art of the personal project and sharing it with editors is the ultimate fast track for getting your work seen and being hired for similar jobs. Show notes and photos from today's episode can be found at photoforward.media/podcast. So without any further ado, today's killer interview with photojournalist Alyssa Schukar. Alyssa, welcome to the Photo Forward podcast.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
All right. Awesome. Well, there's a lot of different ways I want to go in this conversation, touching on being a freelancer, some of the work you did in North Dakota, of course. But first off, I just want to start with kind of what you think it means to be a Midwest photographer. So as a fellow Midwesterner, what's sort of unique about being a photographer from the Midwest?
Sure. That's a good question. It's funny that you asked that because less than a month ago, I moved to DC. So while I may not physically be in the Midwest, I feel like it's still a big part of who I am. And it really informs my work, especially as I think about the people back home who are often overlooked. I mean, we talk about flyover country, and I think that's a real thing. And that though I live in DC, many of the people that I've met in my work and in my life are affected by things that happen in this city, even though they are so far away from it. I think about often this woman I know in Nebraska, which is where I'm from, who lives in a one-woman town. Her name is Elsie Eiler, and she lives in Monowai. She's lived there almost her entire life, and has lived there alone for the past 15 years or so following the death of her husband. And she's got like a tavern there, and people from like a 16-mile radius come around to spend time with her, to have like a cup of coffee or to have a beer or play a game of pinochle. I feel like she has informed my work in more ways than anyone else because she taught me the value of slowing things down and having a conversation. You would think that a one-woman town would be a very lonely thing, but she's one of the most connected people I've ever met. So I always think about that when I'm working out in the field and when I'm interacting with people about like the value of taking a moment to stop and make a genuine connection with someone and to show them through your presence and through your photography that they matter to you. And so I think like you can have that sensibility in any part of the world where you're working, but it's one that maybe we're a little bit more accustomed to because life is a little bit more quiet and slower in the Midwest in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm. How do you kind of slow down? Because a lot of times we're out on assignments that, it's moving quick, filing pictures, all of that. How do you still kind of balance that dichotomy of slowing down and capturing all of that at the same time?
Oh yeah, it can be tough. I mean, whether it's a newspaper or magazine assignment or something for a more commercial or nonprofit client, it's often something where we really have to connect with someone as quickly as possible. And I think in a lot of ways that's a learned skill, being able to make someone feel like they're the center of your world for that time. It can be really intense in a lot of ways because it's this quick building of a relationship where you're trying to understand them and you're trying to also be vulnerable with them so that they will open up to you and that they will help you. They'll basically enable you to tell their story better. So there's no like one way to do it. I think it really depends a lot on the people, but I'm always surprised by how willing others are to be photographed and to have their stories told and to feel understood in some capacity. And I think that's a privilege, but it's also like a pretty big responsibility that we don't do it wrong. And that's what's so hard when we're working quickly on a job where we have to turn images around right away is it's fleeting and we can't always do the most complete job. But I think that's, what years of experience can enable you to do is get in, understand someone to the best of your abilities, and share their stories with the viewers.
Is that a skill that you've always had, or is that something
No.
growing up? Like, no?
No, tell you what, I was a painfully shy child and teenager. And that's something that's definitely had to be developed. I think, I came to photography because I was interested in taking pictures of inanimate objects in my family's backyard with my dad's old Pentax. But the reason that I stayed in it is that I realized that it was a passport to the lives of others. It was a reason to connect with others. And now, like, I certainly love photography and enjoy consuming it, but more than anything, I'm addicted to these interactions with people and these moments to better understand our world, because I think that's really what we do is in a more intimate way and in a more detailed way understand what makes up the lives that we are inhabiting. And I think we learn about ourselves through learning about others.
Yeah, that's really a beautiful sentiment. And when did that transition happen? Was that kind of around, college, first job? Like when did that moment kind of shift for you from going like, well, I like to take pictures to I like to tell people's stories through pictures?
That's a good question. I mean, I think my goal is always to be evolving and always to be growing as a photographer and as a person. I know that I started to get that bug when I was in college. When I had the good fortune of being able to do 4 internships while I was in school. And that was kind of the time before internships were a rare thing. So I'm very, very lucky that way. It's something that grew. And even leading up, you earlier brought up the Standing Rock demonstrations in North Dakota, having that experience alone, which was just 4 years ago, taught me about how to be a better photographer and taught me about how to better connect with people. And, it's something that if we're open to it, we will always better evolve. And so it's been something that's really come with time. I think in college, I was just trying to become a better photographer. And then right out of college, I was trying to become a better journalist, or trying to survive as a journalist, which was really tough at the time. And I was fortunate to get a staff job. And then when I went into freelance, I was trying to survive as a freelancer. So like, as these like big life changes happen, and as the industry evolves and as I evolve as a photographer, I'm open to these ways to better understand and better photograph the people and spaces surrounding me.
So getting into that, that you actually just recently moved, relocated to DC. I think as somebody who's relocated recently as well, how's that been going? How has that been transitioning your freelance work from one part of the country to another?
It's been interesting. I felt a lot less anxiety about it than I did moving to start freelancing in Chicago. So far, I have been on the road about half the time that I've lived here. So I can't totally speak to what it's like to be a freelancer in DC, but I'm starting to get a sense of it. I had a political assignment in DC proper today. So it's kind of, it's starting to come together. And I think, so much of this industry is about relationships. And so I'm grateful for the past 5 years that I spent in Chicago, getting to know the industry, getting to understand the market, building relationships with editors. So it's been a fairly easy transition so far. Of course, we're going to go into a slower stretch. December and January is always slower in the freelance world, but I'm kind of looking forward to that as an opportunity to sort of reset, think about the year that passed and also the years that are coming. I think it's always really helpful for us to have, as photographers, to have short-term goals and long-term goals, and kind of figure out what our place is in the industry, and how we can make ourselves better and make the industry better too.
Yeah, that time for reflection, especially in kind of a big life-changing moment, is really nice to just step back and go, all right, where am I at? Where do I want to go? All of that. Any pointers for photographers who are considering moving or relocating that you might have for them?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is to connect with other photographers in the area. When I started in Chicago, word of mouth saved me. If other photographers hadn't recommended me for jobs that they couldn't do, I probably would have gotten a job at a bar or a coffee shop and just tried to make it work for a while. It wasn't guaranteed for me, and I am in the position where I have to make money. So, get connected with that community. I always like to say that you have to be an active part of the community of creating the community that you want to be a part of. And that includes when you're just landing in town and you're trying to figure out, okay, what's the most important press pass, for example, which I'm just now figuring out in DC. How do you navigate those spaces? And the way that you're going to figure that out is by approaching other people and also being approachable. And I always think I wouldn't have been able to make it this far in the industry had others not helped me. So I'm trying to help anybody who comes along. In fact, just yesterday I had an hour-long conversation with a photographer who's moving to DC, and I was like, well, I haven't been here long, so I don't have a whole lot of good tips for you, but here's what I do know, and here's what I learned from moving to Chicago 5 years ago. And that stuff goes a long way, and I think that it doesn't do us a whole lot of good to sort of circle the wagons and kind of try to protect our patch of grass. But if we help each other, we'll make the industry stronger, and we'll make the industry better, and just a more pleasant place to work, and hopefully a more inclusive place to work.
Right. I mean, essentially, we're all on the same team, and sometimes that gets lost.
Yeah. Which, you got to make a living. So I understand it to an extent. But even having conversations about what's a fair day rate and what weekly goals and annual goals you should have financially too, that way we don't undercut each other. I think that's important.
Yeah. And I want to get into kind of that transition from staff to freelance. I think that's something that a lot of people, it's on their minds of how do I go freelance? How do I do that? But before we get there, how much do you think it's important to be sort of the photographer for a certain geographic area versus kind of finding your voice independent of geography, of location? What do you think the balance is between that? Because it seems like we're pulled in both directions. Like you want to explore and make the work and move around and do all that. But if you don't get hired in a particular place, well, you don't get work.
Yeah, that's a real struggle, and I think that it's sort of a chicken or egg situation too. Like, which is going to come first? For me, I feel very connected to the Midwest. Even if I'm in the Eastern time zone, I'm always thinking about that and always thinking about kind of the comparisons, especially as I've just recently moved. I feel that you only get hired for the work that you've demonstrated you're able to do, whether that's on your Instagram or on your website or for editors that you've worked with previously. And so I think that when you're trying to establish yourself, whether in a local context or as more of a photographer who takes assignments around the country or world, you have to do these assignments. You have to basically self-assign. You have to find a story that you can work on that will demonstrate your skills and also speak to what you're passionate about and what you want to do. Like I never intended to be a photographer who does a fair amount of work traveling around the country. It's just sort of something that's come together. But had I not done that, had I not worked on projects in Chicago and a little bit in Omaha when I was still on a staff job, it would have been really hard to establish myself at all, whether regionally or nationally or as a particular kind of photographer. And so it's really important to figure out what your voice is, figure out what interests you, and how that fits in the larger market. Because you can do passion work until you're blue in the face, but if it's not connecting with people and if it's not getting eyeballs on it through getting editors' eyeballs on it, it's going to be hard to go beyond that work. And some of that's a little bit of luck, but a lot of it is paying attention to the market and thinking about what your space is in that market. And I also think as photographers, we have, especially when we're starting out, there's a lot of pressure to like know exactly the way that we see and know what interests us. And I think that we don't, however, want to pigeonhole ourselves too early, especially, when you're a photographer working in your first 5 or 10 years. Think about what makes you capable of telling stories rather than specifically what your vision is, because that will come in time. You'll be drawn to the stories that speak to you, and you'll be drawn to the stories that you're most capable of telling. But I think that there's like, for me, being from Nebraska, I was like, oof, I don't know what's interesting, like how do I figure that out? And I'm not in one of these big cities, and it's going to be really hard for me to stand out from other photographers because like very few people have even been through Nebraska. But by starting like that, the story of the one woman town, like that created in me this interest in documenting stories about change, because this world that she had existed in for the past 76 years has changed. Everything's gone. It's disappeared. And so having that idea, this looking for ways that things change. When I moved to Chicago, I started working on this story about an industrial community just over the border in Indiana, and started looking at how they were changing as the oil refinery that neighbored them to the north was starting to buy their homes and demolish them. And so, I think finding these ideas, finding these kernels in these themes will lead to more work, both for yourself in your personal projects, but also for commissioned work. That was a very long answer to your question, but I'm hoping I got there in some capacity.
No, it's a good answer. It sounds like a lot of these personal projects that you've worked on have really led into a lot of the work that you're getting hired for.
Absolutely. In fact, one of my first travel assignments for the New York Times was to go to southern Texas to do a project looking at environmental inequality. And the editor specifically told me that he had hired me because of the work that I had done on the industrial community in Indiana. You can't get any clearer than that. It's the truth, because there are so many good photographers out there that saying that you'd be able to do that assignment isn't the same as showing that you'd be able to do it.
Mm-hmm. And how did he find that particular piece? Or did you just self-publish it? It got around?
It had published on the New York Times Lens blog.
Okay.
And that can be a real struggle too. I mean, we have a beautiful built-in audience with Instagram, but there's also a lot of noise. I'll take that back. I also made a visit to New York and showed it to him in an early stage. And so that's really valuable too. If you're able to make those visits, if you're able to build these relationships, again, it's all about relationships in this industry. And show like, okay, this is what interests me, and then also following through on it and completing the project and getting it published. It's hard to get a personal project published, but there are places that will bring it to light, and there are ways to get an audience and get it before editors.
All right, so we've touched a little bit on some personal work and transitioning that into getting hired. So I want to go back a little bit and really going deep on that transition from a staff position to a freelance one. How did you do that and not lose your mind in the process? Because it seems like that is one of the more challenging kind of career path decisions that photographers, videographers, multimedia creators, they're making nowadays.
Yeah, it's crazy. So I used to work for the Omaha World Herald, and when I left the paper in 2014, they had a dozen staff photographers, and now they're down to 2. And I think that you see that at a lot of publications across the country. There's just this huge dip. In fact, I often think of the New York Times, which has a similar dip. They had 45 staff photographers around that time, and now they're down to about a dozen. And I think that that's just really indicative of the way that the industry is changing. So in some ways, I feel like I had good timing, but in other ways, I also remember all of the self-doubt that I experienced and the struggle that it took to really establish myself. And right now, I'm fortunate enough that about 75% of my work is for newspapers and magazines, but at that time it was about 10 or 15% was for newspapers and magazines. Part of that was that newspapers weren't hiring as much, and part of it was that I couldn't afford to work for the day rates, especially that some of the local publications were offering. So I had to really diversify my income. I did a lot of teaching then. I took on 2 classes at Columbia College in Chicago. I tried to take on like a little bit more portrait work. I was a second photographer for a number of weddings, which I'm happy to report I'm now retired from doing. But like it was rough. And when I started doing that personal project that I mentioned in Indiana, I was pretty sure it was going to be my last documentary project. I was just like, I don't think it's gonna happen. So I'm gonna do one last swing at it and see if it can stick. And I also was doing a fair amount of multimedia, a lot of like one woman band situations, which are always really difficult to do. I'm sure the listeners who do multimedia and video can appreciate that. But it was all about just bringing in income from every direction possible. I often tell students that when you're establishing yourself as a freelancer, it's really important to think about your cost of doing business. The National Press Photographers Association has a great calculator for that. And so you take that number, you have like this general idea of how much you want to make in a year, right? And then you divide that by the number of weeks that you want to work in that year. So say 50 weeks. And the first year, my weekly goal was just to make $500, which is not really enough to survive, but it felt like something that was attainable, because you don't want to set goals that are not going to be attainable either. But I knew by having that number that I could take a job that paid only $200, because there's a decent chance that if I got 3 of those jobs, I'd make my goal for the week. But then as the years progressed, and say I went up to like 1,000 a week as a goal, if a $200 job came along, I knew that I'd have to get 5 of those in a week, and that wasn't as likely to happen. So I knew that I couldn't afford to take the $200 jobs anymore. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it definitely does. And was it just a matter of persistence and just kind of gritting through it when it seemed like, you were at your wit's end?
I think so. I mean, there's just not much you can do to hurry it up. So you have to wait, and you have to keep involving yourself in the community, like I said, and like seeking out other ways to get work. So like doing assisting work, for example, none of this stuff paid very well, but it kept me in the business. And that's always been the goal, is stay in the industry as long as I can. I also will say, full disclosure, I'm fortunate because I'm married and I have health insurance. I think that's like the magic behind any successful freelancer, is someone who helps them with health insurance. I think it's possible to do it without, certainly, but there are these everyday struggles. Having someone whose income was reliable made a really big difference too. So it's, you kind of figure out what your situation is, and you try to capitalize that on it as much as possible. But honestly, it took 2 years before I was really established. And again, I think a lot of that had to do with being fortunate with how the industry was changing and moving towards freelance photographers.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, because when people think about kind of that transition, maybe they've had a rough month or 2 or 3 or 4, and then it's great. It's nice to kind of take a step back and think, well, this was a 2-year process of really before you kind of felt more comfortable in it.
Totally. Yeah. And that's awful. And I mean, I think that's the point when a lot of photographers end up going another route. It's hard if you have a job working at a restaurant or a cafe or a bar, because you have to keep showing up for work and an assignment will come along. So it's like, you're trying to you're racing against having to do that. But the reality is sometimes the market just doesn't come your way, or the market changes, or, there are so many different factors. And I think often that photographers feel like that's a reflection on their skill set, but more than anything, it's a reflection on the struggles of the industry and the reality that many people have to face.
So I want to get into now some of your recent work. I do still want to touch on North Dakota, because I think that is just such a really impressive piece of work and such a story to be a part of. But I want to touch on some of your recent work. I saw you were down covering the border wall construction. So tell me a little bit about what it was like being down there, and kind of something you touched on earlier in the conversation, that role of both empathy and objectivity on such a big issue like this.
Yeah. Oh gosh, that was a whirlwind, as many of my assignments are. I found out we were waiting for Border Patrol to let us know when we were going to be able to photograph the wall. So I was kind of waiting that week, and then got word the day before that we were going to be able to fly out there and do the job. So it's a really interesting community to work in. It's a very open space, I felt. It's an area of the country that I think is often misunderstood, and the people who live there long for better understanding, especially the Border Patrol agents that I embedded with. That was kind of a challenge, especially as the main gist of the story was about the new border wall that has gone up in the last couple of months. There's a huge swath of land, of borderland in that area, and only a portion of it is covered. Really, only a small portion of it is covered. And so we were talking with the Border Patrol agents and also photographing the new part of the wall. Of course, we had like 15 minutes to photograph it, and I was tasked with doing both still photography and drone work of it. So I had 10 minutes to do the still photographs, and then I got the drone up for final 5, and I was at 4 minutes 30 seconds I was getting hollered at to take the drone back down. But that's kind of what we work with. Like you were saying earlier, there's just a demand to get things done quickly. It was an interesting experience to go out with the Border Patrol, because there's almost a sense of camaraderie with the migrants that they catch who are trying to cross the border there. Many of the Border Patrol agents are Latino, and almost all of them speak Spanish. And so there's this, with the migrants who they captured that morning, there was like a connection, because they spoke the language, and they joked with them, and they had this ease of interaction there that really surprised me. And I think that's the thing we often miss out on hot button issues like the border wall, is the people who make up those stories and the people who interact in those spaces. it's an interesting part of the country because many people there don't necessarily support the president's agenda, but many support the Border Patrol. So there's also this sort of cognitive dissonance, or at least an unexpected tendency among the people there. But I think too, like, that's part of our job as journalists, is to get into these spaces and try to understand what the political and social and cultural impacts and influences of a community are.
And do you think that's a struggle, kind of given the, I guess backlash is the right word against the idea of sort of parachute journalism, where, sometimes you only have that short amount of time. You're sending in someone who's not from the area as someone who's done the same thing. It's a challenge because you don't feel like you actually get a chance to find those nuances.
Totally. Yeah. And you don't want to, I think a big part of our job is to fight against enforcing stereotypes, right? Because whenever you do enforce a stereotype, you are basically limiting the experiences in the life of a person, because no one truly fits a stereotype. There's all of these different nuances, as you said, to everyone's experiences. And that's a huge struggle. I was in contact with a friend of mine who's actually from the area. And turns out her dad used to be a Border Patrol agent. And so it was helpful for me to have those conversations with her too. And, just that's not always possible, but it was fortunate because there's this opportunity to maybe have a better understanding and to know who are the people to talk to, and also to have this person to check in with and be like, hey, do you feel like this is accurate? I think that there's a lot of pressure right now for photojournalists be activists. And that's something that I think we really have to fight. I think that we can advocate for individuals, we can share their stories, and we can illustrate what they've gone through and how public policies affect them, and how the economy affects them. And, these different aspects that are examples of the larger conversations that we're having across the country. But I also think that we can't go into a space and try to change that through our work. I think that we have to report what we see in an honest way that is going to, by the mere truthfulness of it, change people's minds. And that can be a real struggle too. I certainly feel like I parachute in a fair amount, but I try to do as much research as I can. I try to speak with people from the area, and I try to understand it in as quick a amount of time as possible. But I think too that there can be value in somebody coming in from elsewhere, because we do sometimes bring a little less baggage, or we bring fresh eyes to a space.
Yeah, it's kind of there's no right approach to it.
Totally.
It's not necessarily better to have a local person or worse.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Mm-hmm.
I totally agree. But I do wish I had more contacts in the ground going in.
Oh yeah, yeah. And the moral of that story, I think, is like you said, like to younger photographers, people getting started. It's like, don't be lazy. Mm-hmm. Like do the work on the front end that helps make your job easier. Absolutely,
and also will deliver a more honest representation of a place and time. I think that's our job, and if we're being lazy about it, it's going to show, and it's a disservice to the people we're documenting.
Mm-hmm. And this isn't, I don't consider this a very techie or equipment heavy podcast, but I did I noticed the drone work in the piece. And is that something you've added into your kind of quiver of skills recently? Is that something that's been in high demand for you as an editorial photographer?
So I got my license about a year and a half ago, and I would like to say that I've made money on it, but the truth is I've about broken even.
Okay.
But I do think that it's been a useful thing with some of the personal projects that I've done. You only want so many drone shots, but it is a very valuable skill set. In fact, I had a meeting this morning with a nonprofit storytelling group, and they were asking about the drone, and they said that that's a pretty valuable skill for them. The real struggle for me with the drone, there are a lot of regulations that you have to pay attention to, but insurance is super expensive. Some clients are okay with like the 1-day insurance that you can buy, and others require that you have like really top dollar insurance. So unfortunately, I shell out a ridiculous amount of money for the drone every year. But again, it's a tool. And I mean, I think like same as the camera in my bag, like it's something that can make me a little bit more valuable and can help me tell a story better. In fact, like I'm pretty sure the only reason I got sent to the border is because I have the drone and I have the license to fly the drone legally. So it's about being available and being as much of an expert as you can be on something.
Mm-hmm. What made you decide to kind of add that to the quiver? Was there something that came up that you said, gosh, this should be a part of it?
I don't know what it was. I felt like there was a need for it. I think I got my license around the same time that a lot of photographers got theirs. And I wonder in some ways if that made it a little bit less applicable. Although again, I have broken even every year, maybe made a little bit of money every year on it. It's just a storytelling tool. I was just happy to have the ability to get elevated and to show a wider context. And it's something that I think is going to get better. The technology is going to get better, and it's already gotten a lot easier to get permission to fly in restricted areas. And it's kind of moving along. But I think you have to have a lot of respect for the machine, because it can be a very dangerous thing. And I think sometimes people don't necessarily think that through.
Yeah. Well, now I want to get into your work in North Dakota. So, and I guess as a way to kind of start that out, I just kind of want to read a quote that you gave for the piece with the Creators Project that I think really kind of speaks to the work that you produce there, and read that quickly. So, I have to approach everyone with empathy and respect and try to portray them in a dignified way. I'm not really much of a news photographer because I don't want to just take images. I want to make them as a collaborative effort with the person I'm photographing. There's a relationship built and a rapport there before I ever start snapping pictures. So can you expand a little bit about that? We've talked a little bit about the rapport, but one of the things I mentioned in there is sort of that candids that read as portraiture. Like could you tell me a little bit more about how you pull together those images?
Yeah. So Standing Rock was a beautiful place, but it was a very difficult environment to make images in, mostly because there were a lot of photographers there. And it was I think a lot of people viewed it as a sacred place. So there were opportunities to uplift people, and there were also opportunities to unfortunately take advantage of them. So what I wanted to make sure I was doing was taking the time to walk up to someone and have like a full conversation before I even broached the subject of making their picture. I would honestly keep the camera at my side the whole time. And I would have like sometimes 45-minute conversations with people, which is not particularly conducive to photography because you need to make the image and you need to keep moving. But it was the only way I felt that I could do it in an honest way that wasn't taking from people. And so I think when you're able to, and I mean, I will say, like I said this earlier, I will always take that experience with me because it taught me so much about listening and not talking for a while. And I think that, again, people want to have, taking someone's photograph can be experiences. And also, like, I was there for the New York Times, and that was a privilege because it then elevated and amplified their voices. And when I talk about making a portrait of someone that feels a little bit more natural, I think that's what I'm trying to do, is make that personal connection between us, which comes through in a photograph, and also find this way to better understand them and to see them in the context of the larger picture of what's going on there. It's not something that we're always able to do, but when we can, I think that it's a wonderful opportunity to learn about ourselves and learn about where we come from. In fact, being a native of Nebraska, I had some sense of the history of indigenous people in the area, but I met a man from central Nebraska who told me about the massacre of his people, and I'd never heard about it before. And like it's for me, that was a very vulnerable moment because I realized how little how poorly educated I had been, but also how poorly I had educated myself. And so I think there's this, when you are vulnerable with people and when you're willing to give of yourself to them as a photographer and as a person and as a journalist, then I think that we get a more complete and more honest look at the people.
How did you get that assignment? Did they reach out to you specifically for, because it seems like for something like that, it seems like they would go to someone more local, perhaps. I mean, because you were in Chicago at the time.
Yeah, so I was lucky. I had an assignment for Yahoo News to photograph Jill Stein. She was out there. And I had hardly at that point had any travel assignments because this was still fairly early on. I think it was 2016. Yeah. Gosh, it was only 2016. Okay. I hadn't really done very much travel work at that point, but I got called up there and I emailed an editor at the Times on the national desk. And I was like, hey, by the way, I'm here. If you're interested, I'd be happy to wait a few extra days before flying back home. And so I ended up staying a week for that trip. And that was at a time when the New York Times had photographers travel a little bit, but they weren't doing it as extensively as they were now. And then I ended up coming back again a few months later for just a few days, especially as the Standing Rock started to get both inundated with winter and kind of started to wane a little bit in its population. And so that was a really good lesson for me of just, thinking about news and thinking about what might be of interest to somebody else. So being available and being in communication. And again, having those relationships, because it would be very, like I said, there were so many photographers there. If I hadn't already had that relationship with that editor, it would have been nearly impossible to get through.
In that sort of crowded space, because I know a number of other photographers who are there and seeing their work there, how did you differentiate your work, your approach, your results when you are in such a kind of media, crowded space?
Yeah, that was difficult. And as you read from that story, like, I'm not a news photographer. It honestly, like, I get a little bit uncomfortable when I'm alongside of a lot of photographers. And I noticed that similar to international stories, there were quite a few photographers working in packs. They kind of roamed about in packs of 3 or 4, which I have never done myself, but I thought it was kind of an odd thing, although whatever works for you, works for you. So what I ended up doing was just, again, like, wandering around and having conversations with people, keeping a low profile camera at my side, and just trying to do it in a way where it felt a lot less like I was taking from people. Because that's, again, like, what I just don't want to. I'd rather be a good person than a good photographer. And to me, that means slowing down, taking the time, making that connection, because people will remember that too. And if they felt, photography ended up getting fairly restricted at Standing Rock because the leaders were sort of pissed off about how some of the photographers were acting. And so I think, like, if you're coming at it from this place where, of course, we have a job to do, but we can do it in a respectful way, and we can do it in a thoughtful way that isn't necessarily about being able to license images down the road, but, more so about documenting this really important moment in American history. Especially as that was on the just ahead of the election and just after the election when I was there. There was a lot going on in the country, and I think that was sort of the beginning in a lot of ways of many of the protests and demonstrations that we're now kind of used to. And I think that that's important to recognize, and that's important to be present to. If there's nothing else, my number one piece of advice is to do the work and to be present.
So when you're going on a shoot like that you have one shoot, maybe it's, I'll stay for another day or so, and then you end up staying a whole week. Like, freelance life is challenging. Like, what do you do for kind of mental health and well-being as a freelancer when things do drag on, can take a toll?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you asked me at the end of a very long, busy season, so I have truthfully not been very good about it recently. And I think, like, in a lot of ways, it's important to admit that I'm fairly burned out, but that I'm hopeful for the slow stretch that is coming, that is surely coming. I like to spend time with my husband. I like to go to art museums. I like to read. I think exercise is really important because it gets you in a different headspace. Some friends and I went hiking in Maryland last weekend, and it was a quick, simple hike, but it was so restorative because it just reset me in many ways. I think that while I'm a little bit of a news junkie, I do think that reading fiction is important because it helps us, again, reset our minds, but also think about human interaction and human relationships and, sort of these larger themes that can be applicable to our work and that can better inform how we understand people. Because that's one of my favorite spaces of photography to work in, is around relationships and trying to understand how people exist within a community. Even if that doesn't necessarily come through in the photography, it certainly affects the photography and makes it more truthful. And so if you think about human behavior and you sort of try to study it as much as possible, it makes you a better photographer.
All right. So one of the other things that I've seen that you've been working on recently is the Prism Photo Workshop. Can you tell me a little bit about that? What are the goals? Who's it for? And a little more information.
Yeah. So in Chicago, we saw this need among younger photographers where they had all of this passion, they had all of this raw skill, but it was really hard for a lot of them to move beyond the first 5 years. Like it's the financial pressure. It's trying to survive in a market that's pretty competitive. So a fellow freelancer, Michelle Canar, who also runs the organization called Borderless, which documents stories of immigrants in Chicago, and Michael Zajikowski, who's the director of photography at Chicago Magazine. And I started this workshop last year. It was kind of just a dream of an idea to put on this workshop that we wanted to use to uplift the voices of photographers who come from diverse backgrounds. So we had photographers from the area speak about delivering on assignment, about bookkeeping, about contracts, about proposals, but also about documenting communities with empathy and working on personal projects. And the idea is that if photographers have these skill sets when they're trying to break into the market, they will be able to survive longer, especially because many of the photographers that we were trying to reach out to are ones who don't come from wealthy backgrounds. And I think that's one of the hardest things to overcome as a photographer, is if you don't have this net to catch you when times are lean, it's going to be hard to survive. And we had really great sponsorship from Sony and from the NPPA, and about 115 participants in our first year. Wow. And we will have another, hopefully on May 23rd. We haven't totally nailed down that date yet, but May 23rd at Columbia College Chicago in 2020. So we're hoping to keep this going and keep reaching out to this community so that we can have more diverse voices in photography.
Wow, that is awesome. That is a great way to have a first conference, and everyone mark your calendars for May 23rd. That is awesome to hear.
And it only costs $12.
Oh,
so
wow.
Come on.
Even
and you
better.
get to go to Chicago. It's great. It's great. Literally.
It seems like the perfect conference.
Thank you. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, Alyssa, this has been a great conversation. We're going to go right into the lightning round of sort of quick questions, and then we'll let people know where they can find your work online.
Great.
All right. What's the one thing in your bag that you'd never leave home without?
My 50 millimeter lens.
That seems to be a pretty common one.
Yeah.
What's the most important thing you've said no to across your career?
A couple of years into freelance, I turned down a staff job. It was a really, 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 really hard decision. And I think it could have been a good thing had I pursued it, but I had built some momentum. I believed in what I was doing, and I'm in the long run glad that I turned it down, but it was hard. It was hard.
Mm-hmm. What keeps you up at night?
I think feeling like you can never totally tell a story completely. I have a hard time letting stories go. I keep wanting to return to them and keep working on them. We can never do something perfectly, so that's probably the number one thing.
What do you do outside of photography that recharges you?
Number one, always with the art. I just went to the Hirshhorn here in DC. I'm excited to go to the National Portrait Gallery this weekend. I really like looking at art that's not photography, especially, and just kind of drawing on inspiration from different places that are a different beat than photography.
Absolutely. So what advice would you give to a student graduating from college, university today about a career in news and or photography?
Figure out what interests you and do the work. Don't wait for an assignment to come. It will always depend on your ability to be a self-starter and to get out there and finish the work and prove that you can do it.
Awesome. Well, Alyssa, this has been great. Where can people see some more of your work and connect with you online?
I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Alyssa Schukar, and my portfolio is at alyssashukar.com.
Well, Alyssa, thank you for coming on the Photo Forward podcast.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
All right. Have a good one.
You too.
Enjoying listening to the Photo Forward podcast? Want to hear more thought-provoking, creative visual storytellers? Well, this is where you come in. We want to get the word out as wide as possible about Photo Forward and reach as many listeners as possible. And the best way to do that is through reviews and recommendations on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you consume your podcasts. If you want to support more engaging and intimate conversations with photographers, videographers, and storytellers the world over, head on over to the Photo Forward page and drop a review or even a rating. It means a ton to growing the show, and I personally read through each and every one to make sure this is the best damn visual storytelling podcast out there. As much fun as creating this series in a vacuum and pushing out content into the void is, I want to hear from you guys. Are there topics or guests that you'd love to get on the podcast here in 2020? Or are there some big nagging questions that you've got on photography or cinematography that you want me to cover in one of these solo episodes? Just hit me up at bbrewerphoto or drop an email to podcast@photoforward.media. My goal is to make 2020 a much more collaborative, community-focused season of the Photo Forward podcast, and I can't wait to keep creating with all of you throughout the year. So, as always, keep seeing, keep shooting, and keep putting your best photo forward. Later.